Hyvät naiset ja herrat, kansanedustajat, suurlähettiläät, minulla on suuri ilo ja etuoikeus saada esitellä meidän tilaisuutemme, seminaarimme pääpuhuja Izabella Tabarovsky, nimenomaan Holokaustin uhrien muisto ry:n varapuheenjohtajana, joka on ollut keskeisessä roolissa hänen kutsumisessaan tänne. Izabella Tabarovsky syntyi Novosibirskissä, Neuvostoliitossa. Hän muutti 19-vuotiaana Yhdysvaltoihin, missä hän asui 30 vuotta ennen kuin hän muutti Israeliin. Hän opiskeli Venäjän historiaa Harvardin yliopistossa, mistä hänellä on maisterin tutkinto. Ja hän on erikoistunut sekä Neuvostoliitossa ilmenneeseen antizionismiin että antisemitismiin ja niiden nykyaikaisiin muotoihin lännessä. Hän on tunnettu ja tunnustettu asiantuntija erityisesti Euroopassa ja Yhdysvalloissa, toki myös Israelissa. Ja hän toimii vanhempana tutkijana Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities in Palo Alto, siis Kaliforniassa. Hän on myös tutkijana Comper Center for the Study of Antisemitism and Racism at siis Haifan yliopistossa, London Center for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs ja myös ISGAP-instituutissa for the Study of Global and Antisemitism and Policy. Hänellä on lukuisia sekä tieteellisiä että muita julkaisuja tunnetuissa aikakauslehdissä, kuten muun muassa Newsweekissä, monissa muissa. Ja tänään meillä on erityinen ilo, etuoikeus ja kunnia saada kuulla häntä. Hän varmaankin puhuu englantia siitä huolimatta, että hän puhuu äidinkielenään venäjää ja puhuu myös ranskaa, saksaa, hebreaa ja espanjaa. Hyvät ystävät, toivotetaan raikuvin aplodein Izabella Tabarovsky tervetulleeksi.
Okay, while we're figuring out the slides, I can actually begin without them. So first of all, I want to thank everyone so much for being here. Thank you for the opportunity for me to deliver my remarks. It's an honor to speak at the Parliament of Finland. I want to sincerely thank the organizers of the event, the Parliamentary Working Group on Antisemitism and the Parliament of Finland. I want to thank its chair, Mrs. Tuppurainen, who just gave such excellent introductory remarks. Mr. Risto Huvila, the advisor to the Working Group on Antisemitism and Vice Chair to the Holocaust Remembrance Association, and Pasi Turunen, Executive Director of the Patmos Foundation. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Mercedes Chimbalmos, a scholar at the Abo Akademi University and the principal investigator of the Antisemitism Undermining Democracy project, who had invited me here first in January. She is Finland's primary expert on antisemitism, and everybody in this room should really know her. If you have any questions, she is the person to turn to. You have other scholars here in Finland as well who really understand the topic, such as Dr. Carmela Lipkind, Senior Professor of Social Psychology at the University of Helsinki. So please avail yourselves of their expertise. I typically speak in academic settings. And since we're here today at a place where policy is made, I feel compelled to say that as a scholar, I do not represent any political party or any part of the political spectrum. I believe, as Mrs. Tuppurainen just said, that anti-Semitism is a non-partisan issue and must be a point of unity rather than division. I'm here to add an important piece of the puzzle that is often missing from the general picture of anti-Semitism. I'm here to speak about anti-Semitism in the USSR, in particular Brezhnev's USSR. In doing this, I'm speaking both as a researcher and a witness, a Jewish woman who experienced anti-Semitism growing up in that country at that time. But before I get to that part, I also want to say that while the primary focus of my talk is anti-Semitism, my concern is broader than that. I'm fortunate to have made a lot of friends here in Finland over the past few months. And thanks to them, I have come to understand Finland much better than I had before. And in my view, today, Finland occupies a very special place in the history of the 20th century. 85 years ago, this tiny country defeated Stalin's USSR in the name of democracy and freedom in the Winter War. I find the story of this victory profoundly inspiring. I lost my great-grandfather, Leonti Tabarovsky, to Stalin's repressions in 1941, a year after Finland won. Millions of my fellow Soviet citizens suffered in Stalin's repressions. By going to war, by fighting courageously, Finland prevented its own citizens from becoming victims of Stalin's regime. I visited the Helsinki synagogue yesterday and was proud to learn that Jewish citizens of Finland also fought and sacrificed their lives in the Winter War. Finland's victory was a victory for democracy and freedom over Stalinist ideology. And Stalinist ideology was profoundly unfree, and it was profoundly anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is antithetical to democracy. Once it penetrates a democratic society, it puts the society in danger. There is a well-known saying which holds that Jews are the canary in a coal mine. This phrase means that the treatment of Jews in a society often signals deeper dangers, or rather the mistreatment of Jews in a society often signals deeper dangers, in particular the rise of illiberal ideologies, the erosion of democratic values and civil rights, chaos and polarization, and ultimately discrimination and violence against other minorities. Today, anti-Semitism in Western societies is spiking through the roof. And with it, among other things, we see an erosion of such critical values as freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and academic freedom. When two universities here in Finland caved to a smear campaign that was organized against me back in January and canceled my lectures, it wasn't me that they hurt. They hurt their own reputations, and they hurt their own publics, the public that they were supposed to serve. They betrayed the values of open discourse and the commitment to searching for truth together as a group that are inscribed in their missions. And what happened to me here in Finland is happening to Jewish scholars all over the democratic West. So I'm very concerned, and that is an additional motivation for me to speak here today. And in my case, there is an additional layer to the story. I grew up in the USSR, where in my own time, Jews could not attend certain universities, certain university departments. They couldn't pursue certain professions and certain paths, and certain career paths were closed to us as well. And I experienced it personally. I left the USSR in 1989 at the age of 19. I went to the United States, and I thought that I had left all of it behind. And yet here I am today, more than 30 years later, witnessing the same anti-Semitic ideology being reborn in the democratic West. And once again, Jews are being pushed out of universities, professions, political and cultural organizations. And with that, I'm ready to start the presentation. Okay.
Something wrong with the cable. Oh. Oh no.
Would it help to, no, it doesn't matter?
I don't think it matters. Okay.
Oh, fantastic. I was confident that we would get here. Let me just see hold on just a second. Okay, here we are. All right. So now we get to the historical part of my lecture. And let me check the time. I know that I'm I'm limited. I have to convey a lot of history in a very short period of time. So why don't we start? I want to start with this image. So this image, for those of you who speak French, and there are probably more people speaking French here than in the US where I usually speak, this is a cover of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This picture here represents precisely what was mentioned in the introduction, the classic but also contemporary anti-Semitism of what is typically called kind of the right-wing, the far-right anti-Semitism, although I have to say I no longer even believe into that division. That division is pretty academic at this point. But the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are essentially, they're the essence of all the tropes about Jews and the conspiratorial tropes about the Jews, which say that Jews want to control the world. But the most important thing about this image is, first of all, of course, you can see, you know immediately that it's about Jews because it has the exaggerated Jewish features. And it's a spider, which is a very common way to demonize the Jews, because what does it do? It shows the Jews are simultaneously subhuman and super powerful, right? So you despise the Jews, but you also fear the Jews. You fear the Jewish power. This document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, I'm not going to speak too much about it because we don't have much time, but there's so much written about it. If you don't know what it is, please look it up. It had a very big influence on Nazi anti-Semitism, on the Nazi ideology, and ultimately it paved the way to the genocide of 6 million Jews. When the Bolsheviks came to power, they prohibited this kind of propaganda. Lenin was against anti-Semitism. He viewed anti-Semitism as a relic of the bourgeois, kind of capitalist, reactionary, czarist society. And he said that when socialism arrives, there will be no anti-Semitism anymore. It was part of his pitch to the Jews of the Russian Empire. So this was prohibited. Now, if that is prohibited, given what I just said, Bolsheviks were internationalists, right? They were socialists. They were against racism. Given all of this, why is it that we get to the early 1970s and we have this image, and it's not just an image, but it's a 3D reproduction it's a parade float. This is what we're looking at is a May Day parade in Moscow. Three-dimensional image. You can see, you can actually put them next to one next to the other, and you can see that it's basically the same image. And once again, you have the perception, right, of a Jew. How do you know it's a Jew? You have the crooked nose, you have the six-pointed star. Once again, the Jew is presented as subhuman and super powerful, but now in the socialist Soviet Union, which is committed to being anti-racist and against anti-Semitism, etc. And for those of you who know Russian, you probably already understand why. And if you don't, you're actually at an advantage. If you don't know either French or Russian, you're at an advantage here because you're not looking at the words, you're just looking at the images. But now let's look at the words. So what makes the difference here is that the words say Zionism is a weapon of imperialism. So you can see how the rhetoric changes, but the image is the same, right? The perception is the same. And this is part of, and I was so glad that Mrs. Tuppurainen mentioned the evolving nature of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism always evolves, and it represents itself as something new to each new generation. So in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, in the Soviet Union, this is how Jews were presented. Now, let's talk about this. I'm going to skip through some of the early history. I will only say that Bolsheviks, while they were against anti-Semitism overtly, They were against Zionism. They viewed Zionism as extremely dangerous. It was a nationalist ideology. They didn't want Jews to be nationalists. They were also against religion, and so they did not want Jews to practice their religion. It was true kind of all over, but they viewed Zionism as a particular danger. So what happens in the 1920s is that they offer a deal to the Jews. They say, you can be part of everything we're doing here, build a beautiful socialist future. We just ask you, which for the Jews just lived kind of freed from the Pale of Settlement, it's a very big deal. But there are two caveats. You have to give up your nationalism and you have to give up your religion. And so for Jews who agree to that deal, everything is great. For about a decade, things go really, really well. Jews who refuse to give up their Zionism and their religion are repressed, executed, sent to the Gulag, and ultimately pushed underground. So this is the first time that we can see already that Zionism is punished in an extremely harsh way, right? Jews who are Zionists are punished in a harsh way on ideological grounds. When Stalin comes to power, things change for the Jews. And again, I'm not going to dwell for too long here because I'm trying to move to the Brezhnev time. Stalin, there are anti-Semitic campaigns that take place under Stalin. And as part of these anti-Semitic campaigns, the accusation of bourgeois nationalism, as it was called then, which is really just Zionism, already begin to appear and begin to feature in Stalinist ideology. So Stalin dies in 1953. And by the way, I should say that he played an important role, a critical role in establishing the State of Israel, but it wasn't because he suddenly became Zionist for, the 15 minutes when they voted at the UN. It's just that he viewed it as geopolitically favorable for him. He viewed it as a way to oppose or dislodge the British Empire from the Middle East. Okay, Stalin dies in 1953. At this point, Soviet Jews have really nothing left of their identity because of the purges. All the purges that preceded that time essentially leave them without a language, without religion, without culture. Soviet Jewish intelligentsia, the Yiddish intelligentsia, is wiped out under Stalin. So the only element of Jewish identity that is left by then is anti-Semitism. So all the Jews know is that they are experiencing anti-Semitism. They don't understand why. They don't understand why they grew up with the Russian language, with Russian culture, with Russian history, with Russian classical music. What makes them different? Why is it that they can't get the jobs that they qualify for but are pushed out of? Why can't they enter the universities that they want to? So the questions are beginning to arise. And then comes 1967. And 1967 is a pivotal year. This is a year when Israel, the Six-Day War happens, and Israel wins in that war, contrary to everybody's expectations, contrary especially to the Soviet expectations, because the Soviet Union was supporting and financing and training the Arab states. They did not expect Israel to win. And when Israel wins, it sets off a massive crisis in Moscow. Moscow is trying now to understand what happened. How could it have happened that such a small country had won against the armies that we financed and trained, etc.? And they look around in trying to understand what happened. They're looking around, and what are they seeing? They're seeing that at home, there are Jews who are now all of a sudden, who are inspired by that victory. They are clamoring. First of all, there's a group of Jews that arises who are clamoring to emigrate. And there are Jews who are also demanding more freedom to practice their religion and to know more of Jewish history, etc. So the Jews who want to emigrate are refused the right to emigrate. In general, you couldn't emigrate from the USSR. But something else happens. When they are refused, and they are called refuseniks, it's like they announce themselves as traitors to the people and to the motherland. And they are fired from their jobs, they are expelled from universities, they are pushed to the margins of society. And many of them were very educated Jews, and all of a sudden they're educated people, and all of a sudden they're left without anything to do. And many of them become activists who are now using their time to rediscover their Jewish identity. They're reading books. There is a movement that arises from outside the country to support them, that is smuggling Bibles, literature of all kinds, ritual objects. And there is a real hunger and thirst that Jews have to understand who are they. This was the question in one of the underground publications. There are also the samizdat publications, the self-publishing it begins to really develop. And so let me just show you a few slides from that time. So this is 1967 onward. So this is a slide that shows you a group of Soviet Jews that is demanding the right to emigrate, demanding visas to Israel instead of prisons. The activists are now, who are considered Zionists, are now being imprisoned. They are being harassed by the police. So here's another example for you of what happens under these conditions. When somebody is identified as a Zionist, they are harassed, they are put into prisons. The refuseniks are learning Hebrew and teaching Hebrew, and that is then viewed as not specifically criminal, but something that the state doesn't like, and so they harass Hebrew teachers. And so this is happening. And these kinds of demonstrations, by the way, they only lasted like a minute before they were shut down. Outside the country, a campaign for Soviet Jewry begins. So you can see this is from the American campaign. You see they demand to release Anatoly Sharansky, who was one of the most best-known refuseniks, who then became a politician in Israel. Solidarity with Soviet Jews. It's a massive, massive campaign that continues for 25 years. This is one of the slides from that campaign. Let my people go was one of the most important slogans of that campaign. And you can see this is a biblical slogan, and it really resonated with people a lot. This is when Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. This is Sharansky, who I already mentioned. This is the campaign in the UK that takes place. The women there specifically campaigned for Raisa Palatnik, also a refusenik. Here's Ingrid Bergman, who was part of this campaign with the refusenik Silva Zalmanson. So it was really a campaign that reached far and wide, and it reached Finland as well. There were the Patmos Foundation worked really hard on behalf of the refuseniks. So here they campaigned for Ida Nudel. You can see the founder of Patmos was Slepak, one of the most famous refuseniks. You see here, you have two refuseniks with President Reagan and Vice President Bush. So this campaign reached pretty far. So the Soviets look at this, and what are they thinking? They're thinking, wow, there is a conspiracy against us. It's a Jewish conspiracy, but of course they can't say it's a Jewish conspiracy because then they would sound like they are learning from the protocols of the elders of Zion. So they're saying it's a Zionist conspiracy. And this is how it begins. A massive campaign begins, international campaign, demonizing Zionism. And the word demonizing here is important because in all of this, when I speak about this, people often say, well, can't we criticize Zionism without being anti-Semitic? And my answer is yes, of course you can. But what I'm talking about is not that. I'm talking about a conspirological view that equates Zionism with all of the world's evils. And this is what the Soviets do. They equate Zionism because they're trying to speak to the global left, because they're trying to split global public opinion. This is in the context of the Cold War, right? So they're trying to bring a portion of the Western public opinion on their side. And what is going on during the Cold War in the West now, on the left? They are fighting for civil rights in the U.S., right? This is a post-colonial time, so issues of racism are really crucial. Post-colonial issues are really crucial. So the Soviets want to hitch a ride on all of these issues. And so they equate Zionism with all of the ills that the left at that time is fighting, right? The anti-apartheid campaign is really important at the time. So they're looking at that and they're saying, well, okay, if we equate Zionism with fascism and Nazism and apartheid and genocide and racism and colonialism and imperialism, then we can really win the public opinion, the left-wing public opinion, to our side. And this is exactly what they do, and they're very successful at it among a portion of public opinion. So I want to show you some examples of what they produce. So these are just photographs of my own, of the books some of the books that they produced. There were hundreds of books like this. Fascism Under the Blue Star, that's it, just in Russian. So they produce them, and that they engage the academy, they engage institutions of Soviet academy to produce these books and essentially to justify what the propaganda is already saying, right? So they create this fake science called scientific anti-Zionism. What makes it fake is that the conclusion of this supposed science are already predetermined, right? Zionism, you must prove that Zionism equals fascism, Nazism, apartheid, genocide, etc. So it is essentially an exercise in justifying a preconceived notion. So by definition, it's not a search for the truth. They translate all of this into multiple languages, dozens of languages. So these are, again, just screenshots of the pamphlets that I have. In English, Zionism is the instrument of imperialist reaction. Sounds pretty familiar, right? I think we hear some of these things today. Zionism, a form of racism. We hear this all the time today. Zionism counts on terror. We hear today all the time, Zionism is terror, right? Or Zionism is associated with terror. So this is a campaign of demonization that is taking place, starting with 1967. By the early 1970s, vast chunks of the global left, which I guess we could call the far left, are speaking in this language. And this is not just me saying. There are scholars who've noticed that by 1973, essentially, this is all set in stone. There is the new left, there is the communist left, there are Trotskyists, there are socialists. They're all speaking about Zionism in this language. This is just another example of how this was distributed. A Soviet publication that was produced in yes, that was produced in Prague. This is a translation of that publication called the World Marxist Review that was published in Canada. So it's just one example. It was distributed throughout 40 countries or so. And if you were a hardcore communist, you were reading this journal. It was extremely boring, extremely dry. You know, people read it because it set the tone. You know, it told you what to think. And there are some really demonizing articles here about Zionism. This is just one person who was one of the leading ideologues of this campaign, Yevgeny Yevseyev. I'd like to show his picture. He, after he died, a Russian historian, Gennady Kostyrchenko, reviewed his papers, and he discovered that he was deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. And so here is where we begin to see how anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the demonizing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, begin to intersect. He could not be openly anti-Semitic in the Soviet Union because open anti-Semitism, meaning anti-Semitism of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion or Nazi anti-Semitism, is not permitted. But the state gave him permission to speak in the anti-Zionist language. And so he basically uses, he reads the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, he reads Nazi documents and Nazi books, and he essentially translates the tropes of classic anti-Semitism into what sounds like Marxist, Leninist kind of anti-Zionist ideology. So this is what happens. Here, I just want to show you a couple of examples. What I did is I looked at some books. I digitized some of those books, Soviet books, and I looked at the terms that appear most frequently in them. And you can see, so here's a book, Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. What are the most frequent terms? The numbers here are the number of times that they appear. Occupation, occupier, aggression, racism, racist, terror, colonialism, intelligence, espionage, secret services, spying. If you read this book, this is the picture that you would get of what Zionism is, okay? Another book, The Ideology and Practice of International Zionism, imperialist, reactionary, racist, aggressive, sabotage, subversion. So this, of course, is not what Zionism is. So Zionism, and the Soviets redefined Zionism, and I think this is part of the problem that we are facing today. We are speaking of Zionism, but we mean different things. The Soviets redefined Zionism in these terms, in these demonizing terms. Zionism, however, originally, in its original meaning, signifies the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And if you're a Zionist today, really all you mean is that you view Israel's continued existence as critical to the future of the Jewish people. But this is not how the anti-Zionist left speaks about Zionism. And so this creates a massive amount of confusion. What I've done here is I have essentially matched the tropes of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with the tropes that appear in Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. So you can see here, one of the, in the protocols talk about Jews controlling global media, financial flows, world politics, etc. Soviet propaganda talks about Zionists and Israelis doing the same. The protocols talk about Jews manipulating world events behind the scenes. Soviet propaganda does the same, but talking about Zionists. The protocols talk about Jews murdering Christian babies, right? The blood libel, one of the oldest accusations against Jews. The same is said in Soviet propaganda, but against Zionists and Israelis. And then there is, of course, the classic one, that Jews serve foreign interests, fifth column, etc. And in Soviet propaganda, Zionists are doing the same. And this is the reason why Soviet Jews are discriminated against. Nobody asks them, are you a Zionist or not? What are your views on Israel? Nobody cares. The assumption is if Zionism equals fascism, Nazism, racism, colonialism, imperialism, apartheid, genocide, and terror, it means that all Jews are implicitly guilty of the same. So that is the danger. Now, how are the Soviets spreading this propaganda to the West? Several channels. One is the media. So this is probably their biggest score. They actually managed to place an article in the New York Times in 1971, but there were masses of articles like this. They were especially using leftist press in the West because it sponsored a lot of this, a lot of Western left-wing publications, particularly communist ones. And when they sponsored communist parties, the assumption was that they would be ideologically aligned. And what's really interesting, I've spent a lot of time reading British and American left-wing press from that period of time. And you can see literal reprints from Soviet propaganda. And you can also really see the switch that happens in 1967. Because 1967, these parties were anti-Zionist. Again, remember, this is for communists and socialists, it's actually natural to oppose nationalism. So they were against Zionism. But the language wasn't virulent. This is what's so important. In 1967, the language becomes virulent and it becomes conspiracist and it becomes one of the Soviet Union's main exports. So Russia likes to think that it used to export culture and ballet and music. But this is really, honestly, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion before the revolution and the anti-Zionist propaganda after 1967 are its greatest export that continues to be alive today. So another channel was the diplomatic channel. So this is the Anatoly Dobrynin, the long-serving Soviet ambassador in Washington. I'm not saying that this is in this meeting with Nixon, he's discussing Zionism and anti-Zionism, but there are memos that are declassified that discuss how he gets instructions from Moscow on how to fight Zionists in Washington. So it says, go and talk to all the politicians and go to talk to anti-Zionist Jews and essentially try to create a division between Zionist Jews and anti-Zionist Jews and try to create division between Zionist Jews and non-Jews. Show how dangerous Zionist is. Show that they are in the way of good relations between the US and the USSR. So you understand this is all on the propagandistic level, right? And it becomes really toxic at that point because essentially what are you doing when you are trying to create divisions between Jews and non-Jews? I mean, it's really, really toxic. Another channel is the UN. So what we see here is the adoption of the Zionism is racism resolution, as it's known informally. So this is the resolution that was adopted in 75, and it was then on the proposal of the Soviet bloc and very much with Soviet support. And the Soviets, in fact, began to introduce really radical anti-Zionist language at the UN already in 1965. So 10 years later, this resolution gets adopted. It was later repealed after the USSR fell apart. It took that long, so later it was repealed. But what's interesting here, and this is, again, to the question of does it matter, or rather, let's put it this way, the intersections of different kinds of anti-Semitism. On the right side of the podium sits Secretary General Kurt Waldheim of the UN, Waldheim, it turned out, I think later, after this, had served in the Wehrmacht in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia and Greece. He was an intelligence officer in units linked to mass deportation of Jews from Greece and the execution of partisans and civilians in Yugoslavia. So there's something really highly symbolic that you have a former Nazi here adopting or presiding over the adoption of the resolution from the socialist bloc about Jews and Zionists, right? You can really see the intersection here. And this is the American ambassador to the UN at the time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He was just destroyed the kind of rhetorically the adoption of this resolution. And if you want to do so, look up his speech at the UN. It's really one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century. Okay, a couple of examples of how the Soviets created some of the tropes that are still alive today. So the Soviets were the first to, and let me say something here. So they didn't create all of it themselves. Sometimes they were picking things up. They were picking things up from Arab propaganda. They were learning from Western intellectuals. So I don't want to say that they are responsible for everything that we're seeing today. I want to be clear about it. I'm just telling part of the story, but an important part of the story, okay? The equation between Zionism and Nazism actually already appears in the British Foreign Office in the 1930s. The Arabists there are already making that equation. But what the Soviets do is that they mass distribute it, right? They take their propaganda apparatus and use it to spread this idea. This idea is among the most popular ones to this day. So I think I'm not going to dwell on this, but you can see how I think this image on the left is from the late 60s, from the USSR. It appeared in a Soviet newspaper. You see how they're intertwining the swastika with the Star of David, and today's left is doing the same. On the right is a brochure of the British Communist Party. Look at the title, Zionism, a racist, anti-Semitic, and reactionary tool of imperialism. I have there's somebody here in the room who grew up with me in the 1970s, and I'm sure he will feel just like me, that this throws us right back into the 1970s. We feel like this is where, like, whoa, what happened? The world has changed, but we're still talking in this way. The Soviet cartoons began equating Israel, and not just cartoons, but also so-called scholars, equating Israel with apartheid South Africa already also in the late 60s, early 70s. Okay, now let's get to this. 1982, this is a socialist publication in the UK. And you see, this is it's a famous, infamous cartoon. This is the Lebanon War. Israel is accused of genocide all over the far left press. Begin is equated with Hitler. This is called Holocaust inversion, by the way. He's standing on a pile of bones. At that time, there are socialists and communists in the West who are already saying there are parts of the left that have really gone off track. What they're saying now about what's going on in Israel and about Zionism is completely anti-Semitic, but they're not being listened to. That train has already departed. Here are some pages from that time. Lebanon dismembered, it's a blood libel, the genocide tropes are all over the place. Okay, and here we get to another channel of transmission. This picture here is located just 5 minutes drive from here. This is Lon Rotin Katu 25A. I apologize for my terrible pronunciation. This is a building. I just took this picture What's it? It was amazing. I appreciate it. Thank you. This is a building. I just took this picture a couple of days ago. This building, for many, many years, even decades, right here in Helsinki, was home to a front organization that was known as the World Peace Council. So the Soviets they created this set of communist front organizations that did things for them that looked like they were engaging in something other than promoting Soviet foreign policy. So the World Peace Council obviously cared about world peace, and it had hundreds of millions of members. These are mass membership organizations. The World Democratic Youth Federation told its members that it was uniting the democratic youth in order to advance their interests. The World Federation of Trade Unions, same thing. But in reality, they were fronts because they were managed from Moscow, they were financed by Moscow, and they And they promoted the foreign policy interests of Moscow. So during times of international crisis, all the major fronts immediately declared their unreserved support for the Soviet position on the given issue. And this happened with any crisis that involved Israel during the Yom Kippur War, etc., and any issue, including the Vietnam War, freedom for Angela Davis, the campaign to discredit Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great dissident, they all united, and they all then were echoed through the left-wing universe. So this already begins then. Okay, I'm getting to the end of my talk. I understand that I'm outlasting my welcome here. The Soviets understood the importance of bringing Western leftists into close proximity with their heroes. People like Fidel Castro, Indira Gandhi, Che Guevara, leaders of the ANC, Frelimo, the PLO, etc. And so the World Peace Council helped organize and sponsor masses of events. So for example, in 1973, it co-sponsored a youth festival in East Berlin, where there were participants from Finland who delivered a huge contribution to the Vietnamese delegation. The contribution was $300,000, which is the equivalent of $2.2 million. So I'm wondering if the Finnish people know where that money came from. I'm very interested to know. But here is here, just some pictures from the festival. Here's what's important about it, is that if you want to introduce and inculcate certain values, you create, okay, no more pictures, excuse me. Here it is, okay. You create mass spectacles. So this festival in Berlin in 1973 brought together 750,000 young people for a week. It was a really fun event. There were 1,000 dance performances, there were parades, there were 100 boat rides, there were friendly competitions. And again, it may seem irrelevant, but there is actually scholarship that shows that collective rituals of this sort normalize and strengthen values and enhance solidarity and bonding. Angela Davis was a star. She was a star of the communist movement. She was a star of this event. This is the event where she met Yasser Arafat, and she talked about how the Palestinian cause was the communist solidarity, international communist movement that really helped to popularize that cause and make it the left-wing cause. Okay, the festival was permeated with anti-Israel messages. There was a group of young people who came and demanded that Israel be boycotted, along with South Africa and Rhodesia. I'm saying this because this language, you see, these ideas are already there in the early 70s. They're already part of left-wing thinking. So I think I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to end it on this picture of the parade because that is so... No, you know what? I'm going to show you very quickly just so you understand how fun it was. It was actually, this festival was called the Red Woodstock because there was a lot of rock and roll and a lot of dancing and a lot of just fun, really fun event. You know, and this is how you inculcate political values and or certain, any kind of ideological values rather. And guess what happened to these young people? They went on to become the elite, right? When the USSR fell apart and this whole thing fell apart, they went on to become journalists and politicians and academics. And I think that's why, and they brought with them all of their values. And I think this is partly what we're dealing with today. Okay, conclusion. Anti-Semitism threatens Jews. It also threatens democracy. Anti-Semitism is an ever-evolving virus. And today's anti-Semitism, the evolution of anti-Semitism today, presents in the form of demonizing Zionism and Israel. It is built out of tropes developed by Soviet propaganda, which itself wove it using threads that include some of the most fundamentalist anti-Semitic ideas humanity has produced, the protocols of the elders of Zion and Nazi ideology. It is toxic and dangerous. Millions of Jews have already suffered under this propaganda. This is why it's important. We don't have to wonder, is it dangerous or not, because we already know that it is. What gives this history urgency today is that we are at a point where Jews are being murdered under the guise of anti-Zionism. Nazi Germany dehumanized Jews to the point where they could be murdered in the millions. Today, in polite societies, in the democratic West, Jews are once again being demonized as Zionists. Zionists don't deserve to live, said a student at Columbia University. And Jews are already being murdered on this basis. We just saw in Washington, D.C., where a young, educated Marxist-Leninist murdered a beautiful young couple, Yaron Leshinsky and Sarah Milgram, an Israeli Christian and an American Jew, 2 employees of the Israeli embassy. Anti-Semitism, once again, is an ever-evolving hate. It's imperative that we understand its current iteration and confront it unflinchingly. And we all have a role to play in combating it. I call on members of the media here to recognize the role they play in fanning the flames of anti-Semitism through inaccurate and biased reporting. I call on academic institutions to return to their role as seekers of truth rather than enforcers of narratives. And I call on politicians to find courage to battle the scourge. Because if we don't, it will once again be too late. Thank you.